So, good morning, everyone, and welcome back. I hope everybody had a great day yesterday, and we're looking forward to a great day today. Today, we have Jonathan Ball with us, and I'm so excited to have him here because not only is he a wonderful scholar and creative producer, writer, but he was also one of my professors when I was an English student at the University of Winnipeg, which was like more years ago than I care to admit. But I have wonderful memories of being in his film classes and writing a very epic wartime saga screenplay, which I still have stored in my basement. So just for a little interview about Dr. Ball, he writes innovative horror, science fiction, and comedy, and has won numerous awards for his many books, which include Clockfire, which is 77 plays that are impossible to produce, The Lightning of Possible Storms, which is a short story collection that slowly develops into an experimental novel, the academic monograph John Paze's Crime Wave, and the surreal horror comic The Eye Collector, which is published by Heavy Metal. Jonathan holds a PhD from the University of Calgary with twin focuses in creative writing and Canadian literature. He lives in Winnipeg, where he teaches serious writers what the MFA didn't, and owns a company called Stranger Fiction that partners with indie publishers and producers to develop intellectual property and provide creative services. Jonathan hosts a podcast for writers called Writing the Wrong Way and writes a regular newsletter called Strange Ink that features original fiction and poetry, tips for writers, and thoughts on making a career as a creative person. You can sign up and get free experimental ghost story at www.strangeink.ca. And I can put that in the chat box. And today, Jonathan will be presenting. And the title of his presentation is I Have New Eyes for You, The Eye Collector and Monstrous Perspective. So yeah, thank you very much, Jonathan.
Thanks so much, Emily. And yeah, also in that chat, by the way, I'll be showing later on like a series of images from the Eye Collector as I kind of talk through some of the ideas in the book. But if for some reason I start to have internet issues, I'm just going to kill that and maybe kill my video. But so that link I just put in the chat is just if anyone wants to just download those images. So then, if for some reason I'm not able to show them, then they're there for you. And I also just want to thank you for using the term creative producer to describe me. That's like my official job title I give myself when I'm doing freelance work. And the reason I made that title up because I wanted something that sounded very impressive, but was very unclear. So I really would like to see it catch on. So I appreciate that. I wanted to take people down a bit of a winding road here in order to discuss my most recent project, which is the experimental horror comic series, The Eye Collector, which is, as Emily noted, is being published by Heavy Metal magazine company's Virus Comics imprint. Since I received my PhD from the University of Calgary's English department, I've been teaching literature, film, television, creative writing at the University of Manitoba and the University of Winnipeg as kind of a sideline. But as Emily says, primarily I own my small media company, a Stranger Fiction, and I work as a writer and producer. I'd like to say creative producer, as I say. And yeah, my specialty is in developing material that has its roots in the horror genre or science fiction genres, but takes this kind of radical experimental approach to narrative structure or narrative voice. And The Eye Collector is really, in many ways, the culmination of my work over the 14 years since I graduated. It's been my main creative focus over the last 4 years, although I originally began that project 20 years ago, because the first draft of the script was presented for my master's thesis at the University of Manitoba. And the story of The Eye Collector spreads out over 12 issues of a comic series, 6 of which have been published so far, and then 6, are kind of forthcoming here. Now I'm going to show you later some images from the series. They're also at that link you can download if you want. And I'll discuss the foundation for the ideas that the story explores in this talk primarily, so it'll be a little ways till we get to The Eye Collector in some respects, but I'm going to delve into my thoughts on where ideology intersects with the embattled ethics of spectatorship. and the potential revolutionary power of media narrative, which for me includes, fiction and poetry. In doing so, I'm going to cycle through a number of different texts to tell a story of my preoccupations over the last decades, 2 decades, I guess, and sort of where my thought has been going, since I was at Calgary there, where you are. The Eye Collector revolves on a monstrous figure, the titular and unnamed Eye Collector. I'm just going to share screen briefly and show you one of the pictures of the Eye Collector. He's a strange amalgamation of the Sandman, the Boogeyman, and the Man in the Moon. And the story that we tell in this comic has a very loose basis in E.T.A. Hoffman's essay, the short story, The Sandman, which was the basis, the core story that Sigmund Freud uses in his essay on the uncanny. He develops his concept of the uncanny in reference to The Sandman by Hoffman, which I'm sort of, again, very, very loosely serving as the ground or the soil for my Eye Collector. I and my collaborator G.B. Kamichik, who's the artist here, have taken that story really far from its origins. And also, I should note the lettering here that you'll see in the comic is by Lyden Redchenko. But before I fully introduce the Eye Collector here, I want to delve into the evolution of my work toward the Eye Collector. And this sort of story at its heart, as I say, is a horror story. My development as a horror author is really rooted on my thoughts on the horror genre and in postmodern narratology. Brian McHale, the critic Brian McHale, argues in a book called Postmodernist Fiction that postmodern stories foreground ontological concerns as dominant over the epistemological concerns, which he sees as this dominant strain in modernism. If that's true, then I've come to believe that horror is the genre that best lends itself to postmodernist development, and that it is a narrow literary field already obsessed with ontological questions insofar as the basic structure of horror is concerned. Because in the horror story, the monster or the monstrous object is always entering an ordered world as either the representative or the harbinger of a chaotic threat, to reveal that in fact the ordered or Apollonian world is an illusion, and true reality takes some chaotic or Dionysian form. For this reason, horror is often considered a reactionary genre, since it assumes that ontological instability produces horror, rather than comedy or positive possibilities, as other postmodern works tend to assume. Moreover, horror seems to posit fundamentally that there is somewhere a chaotic but true reality that, although repressed, will inevitably return to rip apart the illusory order. So my teaching and creative work in recent years has revolved around texts where the monster of the story serves less to do that, less to represent some truer reality, than to destabilize the narrative voice itself and the narrative world. In this way, such monsters, the monsters I'm interested in, although they borrow from the Lovecraftian mold of cosmic horrors, they transcend those binary oppositions that fascinate Lovecraft, and which Lovecraftian creatures, being avatars of evil, are always tending to represent the struggle between. One of the hallmarks of my Eye Collector, for example, is its insistence that rather than attempting to harm the other characters, the Eye Collector is trying to help. Unfortunately, the Eye Collector, being a monster possessed of multiple perspectives, he's literally collecting perspectives, collecting these eyes that circle around him. The Eye Collector is unable to comprehend what it means to live inside of a single point of view. So fundamentally, the Eye Collector doesn't understand how humans work. And it doesn't realize that the worst thing it could do is what it is continually trying to do, give humans what they want in exchange for adding their eyes to its collection, thus growing its power by the exponential increase of its perspectives. And each time that creature grows less human and more far from humans, at least, and less equipped to help them rather than harm. Additionally, the monsters that I'm interested in go further than typical postmodern monsters, which too often to me at least, serve to simply recuperate and revitalize traditions rather than undermine them. What the monsters that interest me transgress is not the rules of their diegetic world or the categories of normalcy and abnormality within their worlds, like most horror monsters. What the monsters I'm interested in transgress is the very boundary between the story and its audience. They transgress that boundary by attempting to violate the safety of the audience position, troubling the normally stable distinctions and distances between the monsters, its victims, and the reader or the viewer. So I'm going to detour through some theory relevant to ideology itself to kind of explain what I mean by that. And a lot of these ideas, of course, will be familiar to you because they underpin most of the academic discussion of horror. But I want to look at the subgenre of the slasher film a little bit closely before returning to this track. Now, the base assumption, now, the iCollector is not a slasher film. It's not very gory, slasherish, story. Almost nobody really dies in this story, actually. It has, these different concerns. But I think like the concepts that I want to talk about are in some ways clearer in the slasher subgenre. Now, whenever we're looking at sociologically inflected textual analysis in its various forms, one of the base assumptions is that characters in fictional texts, whether they're novels, films, video games, or whatever, bear similarities to living subjects in the social field. This notion that we can look to texts, to fictional situations, in order to come to relevant or meaningful conclusions about the so-called real world and about real people, individually or as a group, is a persistent theoretical idea, despite constant disagreement regarding exactly how, why, or even to what degree such a thing might be possible or even desirable. But no matter how great the divide in other respects, a shared assumption underlies most academic thought in this arena, which is this assumption that the mechanics of storytelling and the practical considerations of the genre are merely of a passing, if any, importance. And what is significant and worth consideration is some aspect of the presented text. Characters operate within normal texts as if unaware of their fictional status. Do they not? I'll soon argue that they do not, but common knowledge has it that characters in fiction engage with their fictive situations as if they were real, even if in a metafiction they're supposed to know better, as if they were living subjects in an actual social field. This is why they often engage academic interest as potential objects of study. But that characters in fiction are not real, and that they are therefore poor objects of study if we want to understand actual social dynamics, is rarely a good objection, for it's clear that we pattern our lives after our fictions consciously or unconsciously in many ways. But I'd like to object to the terms of the implicit assumption and argue the following, that these characters in fictions always act as if they were not real, as if they were fully knowledgeable of their fictional status and yet forced to deny it, compelled to choose willingly, for good or ill, according not to any psychological drive, but to their narrative drive. Moreover, it's this lack of psychological rationality that makes them truly analogous to subjects in the social field. Now, before getting further into that and getting to the slasher film, I want to just touch on Kafka's work for a little bit. In my book, The Politics of Knives, which uses long experimental prose poems to examine the interrelations of cinema, spectatorship, and violence, I offer a surrealistic ending to Kafka's unfinished novel, The Castle, where, in my story, K finally gains entrance to the castle, the thing he can never do in the novel. He does this by transforming into a movie camera. In that way, by transcending to become the narrative voice rather than a character it comments on, Kay is even able to gain access to Count West-West's inner sanctum. Count West-West is the count in the castle. So, from the book, Count West-West in his chambers in the spire gleaming crazy, windows glinting out of reflected sun, recalls the wisdom of Augustine. Illuc ergo venit ubi erat. He arrived where he already was. At his desk, the final desk, head bowed, West-West copies his sentence. But it is late evening when Kay arrives, when the camera tracks here, my chair empty. In an empty room at a desk, these empty words. Now, notice how I'm not only returning to the novel's opening lines in the ending of my story here, but also collapsing the narrative situation to conclude with a flat description of the very words that themselves are doing the describing in this, as that story film crashes to black. Now, in writing of Kafka's approach to characterization, Milan Kundera asks us to consider the very unreality of the Kafkan character relative to the so-called well-rounded characters of psychological realism. Using K from the Castle as his example, although the observations are also relevant to Joseph K from the trial, Kundera asks, quote, "What is it that defines K as a unique being? Neither his physical appearance, we know nothing about that, nor his biography, we don't know it, nor his name, he has none, nor his memories, his predilections, his complexes, his behavior. His field of action is lamentably limited. His thoughts, yes, Kafka unceasingly traces K's reflections. But these are bent exclusively on the current situation. All of K's interior life is absorbed by the situation he finds himself trapped in, and nothing that might refer beyond that situation is revealed to us." End quote. Now, the popular view of Kafka's worlds is that they are bureaucratic, paranoid nightmares, although Kundera and other commentators are quick to point out the black and occasionally slapstick humor in Kafka's writings. Kafka's characters generally, and K in particular, do seem to be, quote, bent exclusively on the current situation, end quote, in a manner that makes the plots of his stories appear to proceed by a dream logic rather than any recognizably realistic causality. This Kafkan approach to characterization is extended to the extreme, although often it becomes disappointingly banal by comparison, in the metafictive text, to become a concern with characters who are utterly constrained by the fictions in which they find themselves present. Not the diegesis and its varying forces, but extra-diegetic forces or factors shape these characters and constrict their movement. Now, that situation of a character utterly constrained and absolutely defined by textual circumstance finds its mirror in a concept from cultural theory that's best explained by Slavoj Žižek as the dilemma of a forced choice. So this is the quote explaining that. "The paradox of the forced choice marks our most fundamental relationship to the society in which we belong. At a certain point, society impels us to choose freely what is nonetheless imposed upon us." End quote. Elsewhere, Žižek gives an ordinary yet enlightening example of how this forced choice operates as a superego demand in everyday life, the one that reveals the reigning ideological operation. Quote, "Let's say that you are a small child, and one Sunday afternoon you have to do the boring duty of visiting your grandmother. If you have a good old-fashioned authoritarian father, what will he tell you? I don't care how you feel, just go there and behave properly, do your duty. A modern permissive totalitarian father will tell you something else. You know how much your grandmother would love to see you, but do go and visit her only if you really want to." Now, every idiot knows the catch. Beneath the appearance of this free choice, there is an even more oppressive order. You seem to have a choice, but there is no choice, because the order is not only must you visit your grandmother, you must even enjoy it. In a permissive society, subjects experience the need to have a good time, to really enjoy themselves as a kind of duty, and consequently feel guilty for failing to be happy. The concept of the superego designates precisely this mysterious overlapping in which the command to enjoy overlaps with the duty to enjoy yourself. The message is you may enjoy, but because you may, you must. End quote. Characters in fiction, in the same manner, analogous to subjects in the social field. Okay, it's just asking if I'm are constantly presented with a forced choice in this sense. So characters in fiction, in the same manner, analogous to subjects in the social field, are constantly presented with a forced choice in this sense. The genres of their stories operate not unlike the social framework of hegemony, presenting both characters and the viewer or reader with a delusional paradox in which free will is assumed, yet actions are compelled, not by internal will, but by the external determining forces of the ideological frame. So just to bring that into more concrete detail, the cliche of the female victim in the slasher films who runs up the stairs from the monster villain is a good example. She flees and flees not out the door past the villain or even out the back door, but up the stairs where she is certain to be trapped and dismembered. The illusion presented by the slasher film is that, frightened and vulnerable, the victim chooses badly of her own free will, or at least its fictional analog. But of course, that is not why victims run up the stairs. She runs up the stairs because that is what the genre demands, because she is a victim in a slasher film. Now, the metafictive slasher film that's Wes Craven's Scream presents self-consciously an interesting variation of that scenario. The character played by Drew Barrymore, talking on the phone with the killer, becomes frightened and attempts to lock her would-be killer out of the house. But of course, the killer is already in the house. She's merely locked herself inside with him, preventing her own escape. Why doesn't she recognize the urban legend cliche of the killer calling the female victim from inside her own house? Moments after she's indicated in a phone conversation with the killer her familiarity with the slasher genre. Why does she reproduce the cliche behaviors of slasher film victims even after the similarity between her real situation and her fictional situation of the formula slasher film is brought to her attention? The killer points this out himself and recommends against taking formulaic actions in blind fear. Now, the answer is obscured in the same way that operative ideologies are obscured by being taken as natural. It's not that had Barrymore's character been able to think without fear clouding her thoughts, she would have been able to make the correct decisions. Nor would her recognition of the scenario's cliches have been enough to save her skin. Other characters throughout the movie, although equipped with precise knowledge of the genre's rules, suffer similar fates. Her fate is that, as a female victim in a slasher film, she has no choice, only a false or forced choice, the illusion of a choice. Her role determines her choice. Her actions are believable because viewer, actress, and character have all internalized the ideology expressed in the story's genre. Things are different, of course, for the final girl, the one who survives or even kills the killer. But similarly, the final girl's role determines her choices. She makes good or less bad decisions that stem not so much from any character qualities, although they're disguised as such, but because simply and stupidly she is the final girl. A series of forced choices are presented to her on the basis of her ontological status as a particular type of character within a particular type of story. Thus, the victim or the final girl are both rather limited roles available to women in these films, with similarly narrow ranges of roles available to men, although at least men in the stories get to the illusory agency of being killers. In the typical slasher film, and any film deviating from and offering exceptions to those rules, are simply further from the ideal, only partially slasher films, but subversions of the genre or partaken of other genres primarily, as opposed to being part of this genre. But in fact, what constitutes realistic or motivated action in a slasher film, no less than in any fictional narrative, is whatever accords the conventions of realistic motivated actions within that genre. Davina Thornley writes, quote, "is within the logic of the horror genre and only there that these rules, like in Scream, the character Randy's rules about how to survive a slasher film, but equally the rules of character behavior and punishment reward within the slasher genre, make perfect chilling sense," end quote. Indeed, viewer response, the visceral reaction that the horror genre attempts to elicit, is itself dependent as much on recognizable conventions of the genre of how a viewer expects or feels they may or must react to fictional events. Davinia quotes Andrew Sider, who suggests that the terror and suspense generated by contemporary horror movies stems as much from the concerns about the medium itself as from a fear of the unknown. And this is clearly the case in the Scream movies, end quote. Scream and its sequels establish and exploit a dramatic tension by acknowledging and then either fulfilling or subverting genre conventions. The viewer's concern with the welfare of the characters is bound up in, or perhaps replaced, by viewer interest in whether or not the genre's conventions will be fulfilled. Generally speaking, Scream, in fact, does go on to fulfill those conventions, although with metafictive self-consciousness. Valerie Rui, in an essay concerning Scream's relationship to the slasher genre overall, argues, quote, "although these earlier women, the final girls of past films, must be credited with ferociously fighting against the monster, the fact remains that they all succumb and are destroyed in the sequels. This familiar narrative trajectory is rejected in the Scream series. The trilogy, in contrast, reverses the tradition, maintaining the longevity of the victims, survivors, and introducing new villains with each installment. This reversal is noteworthy and resonant because in doing so, the trilogy preserves the significance and importance of the female survivors over that of the killer, while inverting the genre's traditional conventions. The female survivors ultimately displace the killers as the recurring characters and effectively adopt essential narrative roles. This effectively allows the female characters to develop and evolve across the film's various installments, end quote. Now, although I think we is right to praise the film's subversion of that typical containment and mental collapse or social isolation of the otherwise successful final girl at the end of the conventional slasher film, and her frequent victimization in sequels, I think Wee's reading of the situation as a reversal of the common situation where the killer continues throughout the series while the final girl dies is too simplistic. Wee writes that quote, slasher monsters ignore the traditional boundaries that separate the living from the dead, infinite revivable, effectively eluding death and destruction indefinitely, end quote. She then goes on to point out that, quote, the killers in Scream are seemingly normal, attractive, popular people who initially appear harmless, end quote, and are killed while the final girl survives. But in fact, Scream's villain, popularly known as Ghostface, does continue from film to film, just not as a person, as a costume that separate killers wear, a voice and a mannerism that they adopt. In a sense, and in keeping with the film's postmodern themes, the killer in the Scream films is an empty sign, a costume void that may be filled out by anyone, and is thus, though not supernatural, an utterly indestructible imaginary monster capable of exerting real and traumatic influence in the world. Ghostface is a sign, a Halloween mask, infinitely replicable, whose violent immortality as an imaginary, yet no less powerful monster, is testified to within the film through the mise en abîme of the movie Stab, which becomes a catalyst for violence in and of itself. The Ghostface killer is thus the postmodern evolution of the slasher film monster and not a subversion of the same. Just as Scream stands as an evolution of the slasher film, one that single-handedly revived the dying genre, and not its subversion. The quest of the radical artist is not, for me, to craft a self-conscious metafictive text in which the hegemony ideology of genre is exposed. Zizek neatly locates the emptiness of that all too postmodern gesture in an analysis of Shrek, which might equally apply to Scream. Quote, instead of praising these displacements and reinscriptions too readily as potentially subversive and elevating the film into yet another site of resistance, we should focus on the obvious fact that through all these displacements, the same old story is being told. In short, the true function of these displacements and subversions is precisely to make the traditional story relevant to our postmodern age, and thus to prevent us from replacing it with a new narrative, end quote. The quest here, rather, I think, is to produce a text in which the framework of the genre is reconfigured, in which the operations of the traditional story are not merely laid bare, but in which generic expectations refuse to be fulfilled, rather than simply fulfilled in creative and self-conscious or even self-critical ways. The ironic tactics of an unsophisticated postmodernism have become an aesthetic dead end. All of this was in my head post-graduation when I published a peer-reviewed academic monograph in the University of Toronto Press's Canadian Cinema series on John Pace's Crime Wave, his postmodern classic Canadian feature film. So in that book, I argue that Pace's film avoided the very trap that Scream falls into. Pace's triumph in Crime Wave is that he's disconnected the postmodern from its ism. Crime Wave flaunts a postmodern aesthetic, but does not reduce itself to a series of gestures or surfaces, nor does it retreat to a stable and nostalgic position of longing for ideologies past. Crime Wave instead displays a profound anxiety about the status of reality, but it embraces this anxiety as the basis for both continual processes of identity production and a kind of dark, ironic joy. Lyndon Hutchin writes that, quote, irony itself inherently undercuts pretensions to master narratives, and the postmodern irony of today does so consciously, end quote. But I think the postmodern indictment of master narratives is operating unconsciously as a master narrative inside of postmodernism. It's ironic organizing principle and originating mythology. When I began digging further into genre and looking for examples of media that I felt served as useful models for a more radical, less reactionary experimentalism, something that would go further than the postmodern insularity of this kind of ironic obsession with master narrations. I started looking at some older films that I think laid the groundwork for later developments in the slasher film genre. So chief amongst these, for me, was the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. That film begins with the narrative structure and tactics that we come to see in later slasher films. And we have this core technique that really interests me. The core technique you see replicated in slashers is the camera's identification with a series of victims. And in simple terms, you're with the camera, it follows a group of victims, and then one by one, we follow the victims as they splinter away from the group. We follow the victim, then the monster appears in the frame. The monster makes this kill, and then since the victim that the camera was following is dead, we cut to another character, the next victim. That pattern keeps repeating throughout the film. We follow the victim, the monsters come on screen, the kill happens, we cut to the next victim, and we just keep doing that until we run out of victims, and instead follow the final girl as she's hunted by and then eventually hunts the monster. Now, the only break to this pattern that you typically see is an early disembodied, distant from the character's point of view shot, where we have no reference for the point of view. We have, you're in the bushes, far away, shaky camera looking at the characters over there. Now, we don't see the monster as viewers yet, but we briefly inhabit its point of view, scouting its victims. This moment has become cliched in these films, but it's always fascinated me for its squandered potential. Here's the audience, spectators of death, sharing for a moment the same perspective of the monster. And like the monsters, we are watching the people we desire to see it kill without them knowing it. And as I say, this is a standard moment. It's become a standard cliched moment in these films, and it's always squandered. It has this, interesting potential that I feel always gets squandered. But in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, you see the film go further. After multiple victims have invaded the Texas home of Leatherface and his family and have been killed, instead of the familiar cut to the next victim, the camera just lingers on Leatherface. Contrary to the camera logic that will later become essential to the genre, we remain with Leatherface as he frantically runs to the windows and looks out, scurries around the room, and finally sits in a chair and fidgets. If we're attentive, even in this short span of time, we'll realize what's happening here. Leatherface is worried. He's scared. Where are these people coming from? The normative camera logic takes over, and we jump to the next victim. And then when we see Leatherface next, he bursts into the frame outside of the house now hunting them. We very quickly go back to the pattern that's going to become standard. But for that brief moment, we sat with Leatherface and worried. We came right up to whatever passes for Leatherface's point of view. We encountered the monster's perspective. And of course, from Leatherface's perspective, he was just sitting at home in his everyday world when strange people started coming from outside. No matter what he did, they kept coming. He finally decides he doesn't feel safe in his house and has to go out and see if there's any more people there. And as an interesting aside, due to stand your ground laws, almost nothing that Leatherface does in this film would be illegal in Texas today. Now, on rewatching this film, I kept noticing that the cannibal family has constructed these various objects out of the skin and bones of their victims. Indeed, one of the first things we see in the film is a sculpture that's made out of exhumed corpses stacked on top of one another. In other words, underpinning everything but not commented on and ever in the film is the film's insistence that this is a family of artists. This is on some level their art. In my book, The National Gallery, I have a series of sonnets called Leatherface Retrospective, where I delve into this idea that we should contend with the film's insistence that the monsters here have a point of view, and that we as spectators, thrilled by the film's violence, cannot divorce ourselves from that point of view. In many respects, we share the monster's perspective more than we share the victim perspective, or even the final girl's perspective when we are, positioned in a film like Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So in one of my poems in that series, Throne, I place the reader in the position of the final girl. Like all the poems in the series, this one's ekphrastic and describes a twisted version of the scene in the film where the final girl awakens tied to a chair at the dinner table. And so before she escapes. Leatherface has deemed her harmless, and since he's no longer afraid of her and doesn't feel the need to defend his home against her anymore, he's now become a gracious host and prepared a feast for her in apology. Now here's the poem where I put the reader into her position and suggest that all things considered, the viewer of the film is more of a monster than Leatherface, since it's the viewer now and not Leatherface who desires to see her tormented in this moment. So this poem's called Throne, and it goes, "You wake into your story. Hands bound to severed hands, wrists upturned for kind knives that never come. In front of you, dead friends make up your meal. Light shines, burns through one mask. Another mask bleeds darkness. a table laid with flesh for you, everything for you. You are their guest. You are sitting on the throne. You would give them anything, even your soul, if you could stand, if they would let you close your eyes. But no one wants your soul, just open eyes. This meal was made for you. You are their guests. You are sitting on the throne. Hitchcock's Psycho, an earlier film, which also laid the core infrastructure for the slasher subgenre, has an even more extreme narrative dislocation along these same lines. So the first section of the film follows Marion Crane. She robs a bank and flees. She's feeling guilty and paranoid and stumbles onto the Bates Motel and talks to Norman. She decides she will return the money that she stole. And of course, she never has a chance to do so since she's murdered in the shower suddenly. Now, it's easy to forget, knowing what we know now about Norman Bates, that the viewers of the original film would not have known who the psycho of its title was. Then, and for the original viewer of the film, who killed Marion is more or less a mystery until the end. They think that eventually they're told his mother kills her and he's trying to cover up the crime, and then they later discover what that really means. But originally, and prior to this point, Hitchcock is just laying groundwork for different red herrings, including the police officer that's seems to be following her for mysterious reasons. Also, it's worth remembering that much of the effect of the famous shower scene doesn't come from any violence, but from audience disorientation caused by having the protagonist of the film removed from the story completely. In fact, in the moment following the shower scene has always been more interesting to me than the shower scene itself, even though that's, of course, the object of most critical attention. But right after the scene, what's interesting to me is that the camera, like the audience, doesn't know what the movie is about anymore. It regards Marion's lifeless body for a little bit, but there's nothing to look at there. So it floats away, tracks around the empty hotel room, but nothing here can hold its interest. It floats to the bag of money, but the bag of money no longer has any plot significance. The camera's lost, but then Norman walks into the room. The camera swings suddenly and violently to attach itself to Norman. He will be our main character now. And the entire orientation of the story begins to revolve around whether or not he can successfully cover up his mother's crime. In many ways, past this point, Psycho is a story of two warring stories. Norman must suffer the monstrous assaults of the previous story's insistence on being told. And that past plot that no longer has a protagonist keeps interrupting the new story. This new plot keeps interrupting that ordinary world and tearing Norman's realm apart. His reality starts to crumble as a result of these assaults from the characters of the other story. In my book, The Politics of Knives, I also wrote a long prose poem about Psycho, where I focus on the ethics of academic interest in the shower scene, which has been dissected more fully than poor Marion Crane. Here's a late section of my poem. She's dead, but her eye still drains open. She's dead, face perfect, the floor screen. She's dead while the camera keeps looking as we stalk through this room mopped so clean. Plastic, the car trunks her wet body, knife-chewed flesh that the swamp's swallowing. She's dead in this letter for her. Hurts our ears, but they can't stop talking. Now employed, the detective finds fresh death. Late night snacks, what long nights these have been. We can rewatch that scene with no music. We can watch and rewatch that same scene. She's dead as they search through her cabin. She's dead, all this black for blood red. She's dead, though he knew of no money. They have their theories, but she's dead. Where else in the horror genre do we see these extreme narrative dislocations where the text itself becomes a monster? Horror has a long history of evil books like Lovecraft's Necronomicon or Chambers's The King in Yellow. But what I've always found more intriguing are not stories featuring monstrous books, but books that self-reflexively present themselves as monsters. Stories that themselves transgress rather than simply telling a tale of transgression. Perhaps the most perfect novel in the horror genre does this, through one of the most abnormal narrative voices I've ever seen. So let's just kind of detour over to look briefly at the opening paragraph of Shirley Jackson's horror classic, The Haunting of Hill House. I won't read the whole paragraph, but I like to just note that I read this as a metafiction. This novel I like to read as a metafiction in which the haunting of the title is a metaphor for how the book is ensnaring readers. The book, being the metaphorically symbolized by the house itself. by Hill House. What accounts for so much of, and The Haunting of Hill House, I always love to read that title as, us, the readers inside of this book, trapped. What accounts for we haunt, the book Hill House. What accounts for so much of the disquieting effect of that novel, for me, is the narrative voice established in the opening paragraph, where you get a third person, authorial narrator, one who's outside of the story's diegesis or the story's world, one who's retrospective to its action, looking back on the events of the novel with hindsight, and thus foreknowledge that's denied to the characters within diegesis. That narrator tells us that Hill House is not sane, although it's thus that it's somehow alive. And the reason that it's not sane is because it does not dream. Hill House does not dream because it is a site of absolute reality, we're told. When Eleanor enters Hill House and loses her sense of self, becoming more and more the puppet of the house and whatever walks therein, whatever haunts it, it's because of her mental instability, which is already apparent in her complex fantasizing prior to arriving at the house, has put her closer to contact with whatever the nightmare of its reality might be. Now, what's always disturbs me in this narration are the words might and whatever. We're told that Hill House might stand, this is what the narrator tells us, Hill House might stand for 80 more years, and whatever walks there walks alone. Well, will it stand for 80 more years or not? What walks there? The narrator has been established as omniscient outside of these uncertainties. The narrator knows that Hill House does not dream, that it has a mind, that it is not sane, that it is a site of absolute reality. The narrator, because it's authorial, because the narrator is narrating retrospective the action, knows what characters and stories are thinking, knows what will occur. In other words, we have the classic setup of a detached, authorial, omniscient narrator, except that the narrator is deficient in one area. Even the narrator does not know what haunts Hill House. The fact that that narrator is all-knowing in the classical manner of narrators, except when it comes to Hill House, suggests that in addition to being a site of absolute reality, Hill House exceeds the narrative situation and thus narrative limits. This destabilizes that narrator's position. Is this really an authorial narrator in any still meaningful sense? Or has Hill House somehow also exceeded authorship? The resulting creepiness, the disquieting effect of the story's ambiguity, thus bleeds easily into a misreading that imagines the novel as a metafiction on which another narrative level, a second diegesis, surrounds the first. And the narrator of The Haunting Hill House has her own life as a character. And like some ancient mariner is telling the story to us in an attempt to understand or come to terms with this unknown thing that both walks within and is Hill House. Since Hill House exceeds this telling, its haunting is also that haunting of the reader. Whereas Hill House exceeds the narrative as suggested by the limitations of its telling, that in fact is the most real thing in all of these narrative worlds, truly a site of absolute reality, the only thing, including the narrator, that exceeds the story's situation and its limits. As such, Hill House arguably is more real than our world, despite or perhaps due to its status as a fictional creation. And we wander through its halls in endless torment, dreamless ghosts. The Canadian author and screenwriter Tony Burgess, who's best known for the movie Pontypool, also consistently makes use of these extremely destabilized narrative situations. In one story by Burgess called Summer from The Hellmouth of Boodley, the narrator subtly insists that we write the descriptions ourselves. Quote, feel free to use your aesthetic sense of spacing when laying out the lampposts, etc. End quote. In a story that otherwise contains no horror elements, the narrator encourages us to add some, also introducing a possible victim for us. Quote, if at this point you're growing to resent the arbitrariness that has been privileged thus far, you must kill this person. Be as violent as you wish, we're told. In this way, Burgess rarely lets readers forget their complicity with the author of horror, how the reader's imagination, genre fandom, and spectatorship cooperate in forging the nightmare world of the story, attempting to kill its characters. Burgess also routinely, although working clearly inside of the often formulaic horror genre, challenges the conventional manner of depicting characters in fiction. Almost midway through his novel Caesarea, Burgess's character Mendez shows a younger man, a patient of sorts, an oil painting he's made of the titular character from Roger Corman's B-movie, The Wasp Woman. Mendez explains his impulse to paint her. Quote, I wondered what the Wasp Woman did when she wasn't buzzing around apartments. So this is what? I think she's here alone in a pretty garden at night, but she's walking perfectly, and she knows she's entirely made up. A character in a movie, a very good movie, but still a picture. So she can never stop being herself, not even for a second, not even when she is alone. End quote. Here we have a character in a story meditating on the situation of being a character in a story and the horror of that situation. What Mendez presents as horrible, however, I think is interestingly not what we would expect. The fact of being fictional, which is almost always in a postmodern metafiction what bothers characters. Instead, here what we get is the stability of it all, the fact that one cannot stop being themselves, rather than having some problem, in remaining a full person. Being a character in a story is horrific because story conventions insist on the consistent nature of characters. They must be themselves and conform to their characterization even when alone, because of course they're never alone. The audience, the reader, always is holding them in the trap of his gaze. This idea for me has its apex in Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven, although I'm not aware of any critic who's noticed it, but I think about The Raven. Think about that raven. What does it do? It enters the world of the story where the narrator sits. It makes itself at home and watches him. It watches him suffer and does nothing except speak. Its speaking is a way to increase the narrator's suffering. In other words, it inserts itself into the story only far enough to move it forward, to effectively control it, but no further. Otherwise, it watches. It watches and takes pleasure in his pain. Its presence distorts reality. Now the study is its own private world. In this world, nothing happens except suffering. There's no longer any possible end to the narrator's suffering because the narrator cannot leave the study. The narrator cannot leave the raven's shadow. The narrator cannot leave because the raven does not leave. The raven keeps him there. Its gaze is his shadow. The raven's eyes hold him, hold his world. He would rather die than remain a prisoner in the shadow, but he cannot die. At the poem's end, the narrator suggests that the raven is immortal, and of course, in a sense it is. It's a symbol now. Even if it physically left the room some time ago, symbolically it remains, and he remains in his gaze. But let's assume, though, that it's still physically there. It's there and it's immortal. In a horror story, what's worse than death is the horror, the monster you would rather die than face, the thing you die to escape. You die because the monster is the truth, and what's worse than death in a horror story is ending your denial and admitting its truth. You don't feel that the monster will kill you. You fear that its killing you would mean that it is real. What's worse than death is what its reality means. What the raven means is that the narrator cannot die. The narrator is immortal now too. He's the myth that he wanted to be. The raven makes him so. Its gaze holds him in the timeless study inside his suffering. And of course, we are the raven. The reader is the raven in that scenario. Our reading is how we speak, and our speaking is a way to keep him there. He cannot leave because we won't leave him. We read the poem again and again and again. Now, in the Eye Collector, I'm just going to throw my images up here, assuming they don't break my computer. Here's our little Eye Collector ready to help. In the Eye Collector, much of the story revolves around moments where me and my collaborators are seeking to stabilize the reality of the story's world and suggest its transgression into the reader's world. In the first issue, young Nathan here is watching television. Of course, in this strange world, televisions just show words, which themselves, refuse to confine themselves to the screen or to that media space. Another page presents the borders of a traditional comic panels as the architecture of Nathan's labyrinthine house, to remind readers that this flat page constitutes the story's illusory geography. In a later issue, our Eye Collector professes confusion when Nathan, faced with the monster, utters the standard horror denial, "This can't be real." What does that mean, the Eye Collector asks? What does it mean to say that something is real? He goes on to point out that Nathan's own brain doesn't know the difference, citing the phenomenon of false awakening, where you dream you are awake. And in fact, quite often when you get up in the middle of the night and then go back to sleep, you just dreamed that occurred, and your memory of it is false. In a later page, when Nathan battles the monster, the single image displays multiple time frames within the fight. So you see the collector standing here, and then we see his severed head down here within the same sort of frame. He's now being fit into the fire. One of the most jarring dislocations in the series, though, comes halfway through. when the first series concludes, and Nathan thinks he's free from the monsters. I'm free, he says, but he's using the eye collector's voice. And we dive into the lettering itself. So we have this kind of brilliant little thing that Linden managed to pull off. I wasn't sure he was going to be able to do. Lettering, by the way, has a strange position in comics and always disinterested me ontologically. Lettering is extra diegetic. It's understood to not really be part of the story's world. They're not seeing the words and bubbles. Even though the dialogue in the lettering is intradiegetic and heard by the other characters. So in this scene, the narrative point of view actually starts to dive into the lettering, into the letter I. We see that kind of happening on the next page. And of course, inside this letter I, inside that personal pronoun, inside of this, we find a door that opens. And then, of course, Nathan's speech, again, the eye collector saying the same thing. Later in the story, Nathan's mentor, Spallanzani, is established to be the world's greatest artist. But in this story's world, artists sculpt dreams directly. And Spallanzani's greatness arrives from the horribleness of his creations. He's unveiling his greatest works, which are a tree of creations, a hoop through which you can see the world as it is, rather than as your ideology demands. This tower, which is a torture device, or a series of torture devices that slaughters anyone who fails to make their way through its labyrinth. Here we have people making their way through the tower. And then at the heart of the tower, if they survive, they can find his daughter, Olympia, an automaton whose perfection drives others to follow her. Olympia transforms and transcends later in the series by ripping through the comics page itself, cutting her own old likeness in half to make herself anew in a new form. She then turns on her co-creator, the eye collector, who must enlist his previous enemies to help him as he had once tried to help them. Help them. He thinks he's helping. His mode of travel involves reaching past the boundary of the comics page. So you can see his arm extending here and then coming around again, doing an impossible loop around the other side, and then lifting himself and another character, Clara, up and over to where they need to be. So this is something that, of course, would be impossible in any sort of semi-physical reality, but it's quite possible if you are just a character flat on a comics page, where you don't need a consistency in what your arm is and how big it is in relation to your body. Clara, and consistently in this way that monsters in the story manipulate the techniques of the story to both destabilize the story, position themselves in league with the reader, and question the ethics of inhabiting the point of view of the audience. At an early point in the series, Nathan's father calls the eye collector a monster, and the creature is offended. Monster, he says, I've always thought of myself as a father, but I suppose it depends on your point of view. That's one of the problems humans have. You get stuck in your point of view. But I have many points of view, so many that I travel through dreams to share them with you, to help my children understand their world. The eye collector doesn't understand how humans work. It just knows that they're broken. It tries to fix them by robbing them of the perspective that entraps them, breaking them free from the ideology that constitutes their world, thinking that this will free them, but it just careens them into unreality and collapse. To enjoy a freedom like its own, humans must instead multiply their perspectives, taking on different points of view, and without settling into any stable identity position. But first, their media and the stories we tell must immerse them in terrifying positions, denying them the stability of an outside position as an audience member, and bring them, like the eye collector brings us victims, into a tower of dreams. So thanks very much. That's my kind of meandering talk there for you.
Awesome. That was wonderful. Thank you so much for that. Thank you. Well, we have time for questions if anyone has any. Does anyone have any questions? If you need to think about it. Oh.
Is that a question from Matt or just clapping from Matt? You're muted if you're asking a question, Matt.
No, just clapping. Yeah, that was fantastic. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
Well, if nobody has questions for now, I have a few I can ask to kind of get the ball rolling a little bit. Here, sorry, let me just call them up. If you saw me typing while you were talking, by the way, that was just me taking notes. Um, okay, so the first thing I think I'm gonna ask, I have a lot of questions, but the first one is actually I'm really interested in graphic novels. It's one of the topics kind of loosely of my dissertation. So I was kind of curious. I'm guessing this is a collaboration. You didn't do any of these illustrations
Yeah, I'm the
yourself.
writer
Yeah.
on this, and then my collaborator, my artist collaborator is. I'll often collaborate on story points with him, with Gregory.
Mhm.
Um, and then he's of course, creating the art. One of the we have a very strange workflow process where uh, we started off with just me writing like full scripts, and then I would give them to him, and then he just wouldn't draw half the things I wrote into the script, and then he would like change things. And so we just kind of like started shifting it into a more of a situation where we kind of like break down the story beats, and we kind of map out, almost we storyboard the thing without a script together. So we kind of like, I have, where the story I want it to go and how I want it to be, and maybe I've got a couple major moments I want to hit. Maybe I've got a speech I want somebody to give. But then effectively we'll map it out visually, and then after he comes back with the images, I sort of try to revamp. I kind of go in, I change the story from what he thought it was into I sort of like trying to tweak it to kind of trouble his images. In many ways, what I've found, like for this thing to work the way I want it to work, and to have this sort of destabilization as part of its thematic intention, it has to end up in a situation where I'm collaborating with the letterer to like put in letters that start altering how one would understand the images. So without so in a certain, like there's a scene that I didn't show here, but there's one where, for example, Olympia opens her mouth. He's drawn Olympia opening her mouth and like a beam of light streaming out, which was what we had planned. And when I ended up writing the script, though, I decided that I rewrote it and rewrote the dialogue so that, in fact, given the instruction of the dialogue, how you actually read the image is that she's eating the light. And so sometimes actually just, finding ways to subvert even what's visually on the page and find some tensions between, like, I'm always kind of just trying to figure out where those poetic tensions are. Because to me, so much of the effect of a story is in this sort of tension between what it's supposed to be doing and what it's actually doing, and, this sort of safety and distance and this kind of interplay. So I don't know if that it relates to kind of your question, or if you had a more precise question, though.
Oh, that was an excellent answer, actually. Yeah, because it kind of leads into this other, and kind of answered that a bit as well too, because obviously you do have this strong kind of scholarly, and also I'm assuming probably reader interest in like horror and the horror genre. So like for you, especially turning that into a graphic novel, and you're collaborating to do this, but it is a very visual medium. Like and I'm trying to ask this question in a really clear way, but you can tell I haven't taught for a while, but basically, in terms of imparting kind of that cinematic structure, was that something that was like a consideration as you worked
No,
on that, or
yeah, you bring up this, it's a good phrase that you use, cinematic structure. So originally the real root of this story was, I mentioned it briefly at the start, but I wasn't really clear about it there. But like the first draft of the Eye Collector was a movie script written for my master's thesis. So it actually was a feature film script in its original iteration. What I found, of course, as I kept revising it and developing it over the years, is that it didn't work as a feature film script. And there was couple of reasons for that, but the core reason was that it just had a novel structure. It just didn't have a cinematic structure, but it had a lot of cinematic elements and the cinematic thrust. So it has service roots in this cinematic project, But then, I started moving it in the direction of a comics novel. My bugbear, by the way, is I don't like the term graphic novel, because comics is the medium, and it's a comics novel. But so like everybody else calls that a graphic novel, but I will like die on the hill of that it should be called a comics novel. But yeah, but you're precisely right. It's very much originally envisioned as a cinematic project. But what I found more and more is, for practical reasons, budgetary reasons, it just made more sense to do it as a graphic novel. But more importantly, it didn't suit the film medium, because there's a different time relationship in comics and film. So for people who are less familiar with film and comics, in a film, the basic block of building a film is the shot, and you edit shots together in a sequence. But what plays out in the shot is time. We see people moving through time. Tarkovsky called this film making sculpting in time. And each shot, so your basic unit is like the shot where we see time unfold. But in comics, the opposite is true. The basic unit is the panel where time is frozen. And time unfolds in the gutter between panels. And that's effectively, the idea that we got these juxtaposed images and then this time relationship that's implied between them. But really, like, the shot is unfolding inside of the gutters. Like, the one thing we don't see in a comic is time unfold, unless you're doing experimental subversions like we do in a couple pages here. So there's just a basic medium difference between film and comics. And what I found more and more was I was trying to freeze time instead of playing it out, and so I had to shift the medium for that reason. But it has that cinematic root that you picked up on.
No, that's really cool. And I mean, I don't know if this is what you were intending, but definitely, certainly with that kind of comic structure and that idea of time and like what's kind of happening in the gutter and the way that's structured. I mean, in a way, I feel like that suits maybe the horror genre really well, like in terms of that sense of the unknown, that sense of kind of tension, of suspense. That's my reading.
In some
Maybe
ways,
not
it
yours.
doesn't suit. Yeah, I mean, in some ways, it doesn't suit the horror genre as well as, say, film does, because you don't get the suspense play out, and you don't get the same dramatic irony possibility. But for my strain of horror, like for the horror I'm interested in, I think you're right, and it does better suit it, because so much of what I'm interested in is distantiation, what Brecht called distantiation. Playing in this zone between immersion and separation from the narrative situation. And so it's too easy to get wrapped up in a film. Like, it's so immersive, because time is unfolding on screen as time is unfolding for you in the theater, and and films can really lean into that immersive aspect. And it's very easy to kind of suspend your disbelief in the Coleridgean terms, but that doesn't interest me. I'm interested in constantly reminding and keeping in the forefront of your head the fact that you are not in the story's world, but then troubling that distinction in certain moments, like making it you feel too close to it suddenly. So to me, like, so much of what I'm interested in is that instability and an interplay. So I like that comics makes you feel safer initially. Like, the setup of it is a little safer. Like, it's just less frightening to read a comic than to sit in a horror movie. But once you start to find a way to break that safety a little bit, to me, it's really interesting. And it's also a nice genre from my point of view. The other thing I like about the horror genre, just as an aside, is the self-selection of the audience. There's almost sort of there's a lack of safety in the genre, ideally, I think, but there's almost also like an implied consent in coming to it. It's not like walking up to somebody on the street and punching them. It's more like inviting them into the ring. So I think in some ways, it's a more ethical transgression of their safety, if that makes sense.
No, I like that. And horror is such a fun genre in a way because of that sense, like you're going into it because in a way you're giving yourself a little bit of a scare, but you're right, there is still that kind of different tension, I guess, between safety, between what's kind of like unfamiliar, that suspense, all of that. Absolutely.
I just find the audience overall, I mean, the audience for horror is often maligned, but and sometimes for good reason. I mean, I think there is a sort of, as I keep pointing out in my work, like there's a spectatorship involvement that I think is troubling. But there also is an audience that just fundamentally is interested in unconventional work. Like they want something that in a certain level is not elsewhere, and there's an extremism that they're potentially willing to accept, although parts of it don't interest me. And when you come in, so there's like I find like more and more the audience for horror and the audience for experimental art overlap in strange ways. And if you also, just on a simple practical levels, if you were to move into the film, for example, horror is one of the only genres in film that still exists where you do not need a star, and therefore can actually work with a small budget, and therefore can actually take real creative risks. And of course, not every film does that, but you have that potential, which you don't always have for just logistical and practical reasons in other genres.
Yeah, absolutely. There's that sense of kind of I've always felt almost like a sense of a kind of participatory nature of horror, like in a way, like the way the audience is kind of invested. But you're right, even some of the filmmaking kind of conventions, even in terms of budget and stuff like that. That is very cool.
Yeah, they're primed. They've primed themselves to participate in a way that I don't know that some other genres, unless you're moving into erotica, there's really no analog in terms of like how they prime themselves to participate, if you know what I mean. And so there's a way of really, I think there's a lot of interesting possibility for subversiveness as a result. Whereas so often in other genres, while there's lots of interesting things you can do, the audience isn't really willing to be there with you in the same respect, and they get very angry very fast if you don't deliver what they expect. Whereas in horror, there's almost a disappointment if you deliver what they expect, because it's not scary.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I can't tell you how many times I like what I just personally, as a fan of horror, get really upset about that formulaic aspect of a lot of horror. So much of the genre. I mean, it's getting better in some ways, but so much of, in movies especially, one of the consistent things that I'll do is I'll start watching a movie. I'll watch 10 minutes of it. I'll pause it and I'll text my friend, "Hey, is this what happens in the movie?" And then, of course, I'm almost 90% of the time I've laid out exactly what happens, because they're so formulaic. And the handful of times when it surprises me is when I get really impressed.
It's a really cool perspective to look at genre that way, like in terms of like, how it is formulaic and kind of what that does. And I'm always interested in that. This is such a rich like conversation and also presentation. Did anybody else like have any questions for Jonathan? I know I've been asking a lot. Anyone else? Or well, if you do, just pop up your hand. I do kind of have another, well, I mean, I have many questions, but I'll ask you one more.
Sure.
So you were mentioning like you are like a fan, and you mentioned like a lot of really, oh, thank you, Matthew. I appreciate that. Yeah, yeah, and you mentioned like, a lot of these really classic horror films. Scream, I guess, is still kind of ongoing. It's almost like kind of like a transmedia franchise at this point. But are there any kind of like more recent ones that you found like maybe like impressive or that have done things that are a little bit more subversive to the genre or anything, or maybe not?
I mean, I think a lot of the new ones are quite impressive, although their misfires are almost worse in some ways. Like uh, Jordan Peele is, of course, somebody people often invoke, who is also great. I thought Us was a film that the first half of that film to me is perfect, whereas I hate the last half of that film because I think it stops being a horror film and becomes a science fiction film, which is fine, but the rules are different, and so there's a level at which it really delivers as a horror film for that perfect hour, with a perfect premise, and it's so tight. Um, but I can't say I enjoy the film otherwise. But the one that I keep coming back to for recent, there's so many good horror films now. It's almost hard to pick and choose. But one I always keep coming back right now to is The Witch. Because I just find The Witch such a fascinating film on certain levels, and especially um, the sort of simple sadness of the premise. 'Cause one of the things that that filmmaker did was research, the Salem witch trials, and really go look at the court transcripts. And one of the things that he noticed that he kind of gets into the film on a certain level is just this the sadness of like why people, because you have these transcripts that tell you like why when they eventually break down having being psychologically abused and just decide to confess, they have to then give the reason of, well, why did you sell your soul to the devil? Like, what did you get in return? Because it's a contract, right? And some of the reasons are so sad. Like, it's like, well, I just wanted somebody to take the ashes out of the stove, somebody else to milk the goat. Like they just wanted like 1 minute of their life to like relax. I wanted a pretty dress. I wanted, some butter. And these it's so small like what these women want, and it's such a depressing and dark insight into their life. What I like about that film is, on one level at the end of it, yes, I don't want to ruin the film for people but who haven't seen it, but the ending of it is almost a happy ending, for that character. Finally they are freed from the oppressive situation that they've been in, and finally they have a community that accepts them. Finally, they get something that they want out of life. And yes, there's a dark trade inherent there, but I think there's always an interesting level where he's managed to both to really twist the audience's position, of like, and take the sort of sympathy that the audience has had for a character and turn it in a strange direction and really make you sort of wonder where your sympathy should have been all along in this film. So it reminds me very much of the when I teach the yellow wallpaper. Often I'll point out that if you just take the supernatural aspect of that story away, one of the saddest things about the story is that her husband loves her, and thinks, but this is just what marriage is in the time period, and there's no way out of it. It's almost better if he's abusive and at least she can resist, but she can't resist because he's trying to help. I very much find that in some ways is also a big inspiration for the Eye Collector, the Yellow Wallpaper, even though it's a very different story. But this idea that like you have this creature that is from their point of view trying to help you, and on a certain level they're right. You're trapped in a box you need to break out of, but of course breaking out of that box is going to destroy your entire world. And there's good and a bad side to that, that the thing doesn't understand the ramifications of.
No, that's excellent. And yeah, I haven't seen The Witch, but I should. But I do like that idea of like kind of even some of the horrors of real life or the horrors of the everyday and how they turn that into this more like cinematic genre convention and stuff like that. That's really cool. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for the suggestions as well. I always love getting like reading recommendations
Yeah,
or media recommendations. Like when I teach, that's actually like my favorite part of the year is like I get students to always give us some media recommendations and we always find like new things to watch. So that's awesome.
that's
Thank you
good. Yeah,
so much.
yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome. Well, if nobody else has any questions for Jonathan, I should probably let you go because you've been very generous with your time. But thank you so much. That was a wonderful keynote, and I'm sure everyone will enjoy the recording when it comes out as well.
Thank you. And yes, I'll have the recording on my podcast eventually.